Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Isaac Newton Institute podcast. My name is Dan Aspel, and I'm the Communications Manager here at I&I. Our guest for this episode is Professor Valerie Isham, who is Professor of Probability and Statistics at University College London. Not only that, but Professor Isham has an extensive history with the Newton Institute. She was involved in programmes here as early as the beginning of the 90s, and she's involved with the current programme, Infectious Dynamics of Pandemics. Valerie's going to tell us all about this and more. We hope you enjoyed the episode. So Valerie, it's a real pleasure to have you here. There are three of us on the mic today. There's myself, Dan Aspel. There's Ciara Dangerfield.
Hello.
Who's appeared on a number of these.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I should introduce myself. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator at the Isaac Newton Institute.
Indeed, and Ciara is mathematically trained, so she can ask the intelligent questions. So, Valerie, we're going to talk about your involvement in the Newton Institute, which has been extensive. But I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of biographical detail for those who might not be familiar with you. Tell us what you're doing at the moment and where you've come from.
Oh gosh. Well, let's start from where I came from, because it's sort of easy to work chronologically. So I guess I did a maths degree at Imperial way back in the dim and distant past. A PhD. I've always worked in applied probability. I've been at UCL since 1978. So again, before you were born, no doubt. And I've worked in applied probability, doing sort of stochastic modelling in general, and then applied to two particular big areas, one in hydrology, climate, that sort of area, and the other in to do with mathematical biology and epidemics, transmission of diseases. So I was involved in the Newton from one of the first programs in the first year, and I've done various things since then. And I'm now co-organising the current pandemics program.
And you've not only been involved in programs in the Newton Institute's history, but also you've been part of like the scientific steering committee and the management committee as well, I believe.
Yes, so I've chaired the scientific steering committee since 2013. So you normally do a 4-year term, so I did a 4-year term, and then it was renewed. But we decided I'd only do 3 years second time round, so that I didn't come off at the same time as the director. So that things were staggered a bit. So I've just had my last steering committee meeting this week, but I've done a 7-year stint on that. And the chair of the steering committee is automatically ex officio a member of management committee. So I've been involved in that and various other things too.
So you must like it here, I'm guessing.
Yes, I do. It's I've had a lot of happy time in the Institute. Yeah.
And I mentioned that extensive history. So as you say, there's a number of programs you've attended, and they go all the way back to 1993, which was Epidemic Models. And 2020, you are one of the organisers of Infectious Dynamics of Pandemics. So a really close bond there. And over the whole length of the life of the Institute, you must have seen how that original program had effects in the science, and you're observing it very closely now with this current program.
Yes, huge effects. I mean, so we started off, as you say, in with the program in '93 on epidemic models. That actually grew out of previous meetings that had been held between small workshops elsewhere. That particular one grew out of a meeting in Skokloster in Sweden in 1990, when we were discussing where we might have our next get together, in a few years' time. And the Newton was just advertising for applications for the first proposals. So it was a natural thing to put in a proposal, which was accepted, and we ran the program in the first year. So we were bringing together I suppose trying to define the state of the art, to establish a strong international network and to force close collaborations. So that was back in 93. And I guess what was special about it really at that stage was that we'd had workshops before, the typical maths stats workshop of a week somewhere where people get together. But suddenly we've got 6 months, and that's a whole different ball game to be able to really get people together for an extended period, to forge those links and collaborations. So I think that program was very influential, excuse me, for the field. And then we had a celebration 20 years later, where we had a further program, a short one, in 2013 and 14, sort of a couple of months in total, where we brought people back and looked to see what we'd achieved and what the challenges going forward were. But again, we brought together this community, widened it, because obviously we brought in new people. But that meant that this time, at the beginning of this year, we got that international network of people who were used to working together in this sort of area and could bring them together, at fairly short notice to address these sorts of challenges that we're getting now. But going back to 1992, 93, that first year, of course, it was a greenfield site, very different from how you're seeing it where you are now. So, or at least I don't think either of you were actually in the building, but you know what I mean.
No, indeed. Yeah, we're back in occasionally, but no, we're kept out at the moment. Yes, that's amazing, because I've seen the photos of the ground being broken back then, but it all ties into this amazing view you must have of the entire lifespan of this institution. And I'm interested, and perhaps like Ciara, you can talk more about what's happening at the moment as well. But the progress you will have seen in the science in that period, it must be more vivid to you than it is to most researchers, because you've had so many opportunities to sort of take stock at various points throughout the last 20 to 30 years.
I think that's very interesting, because one of the outputs of that first meeting was a discussion paper at the Royal Statistical Society, where we tried to identify the challenges going forward. Then when we met again in 2013, we were looking to see, to what extent have we met those challenges, and what are the ones going forward. And now again, and when you look at those challenges, they're still there. Yes, we've achieved a huge amount, but nevertheless, many of the challenges are still what one thinks of today, the things to do with heterogeneity, for example. So we've made a lot of progress, a lot of work been done, and our understanding of the pandemic now is, to a good extent due to the work that's been going on over that period of, nearly 30 years. But the other thing, of course, is there have been huge differences in what you can do numerically, computationally, and that, that really changes things. So whereas an awful lot of the work was done algebraically, early on, and with fairly simple models and fairly simple simulations. Of course, now people can do much bigger things with much more structure, bigger populations, much more complex things. And I think there that the challenge sometimes becomes necessary to sort of step back and say, well, do we actually need all this complexity? What is the question you're trying to answer? And this trade-off between simple, robust models that can tell you quite a lot, and much more complex things where you can put in all this structure, but then you're making a lot of assumptions about that structure, which may affect your answers, and how you sort of balance those two things. I think that's an important thing going forward. But undoubtedly, we can do a huge amount more than we could then.
That's quite interesting when you said it. I hadn't thought about it like that, the idea of the fact we've got better computing power now. And so, of course, when you guys started in the early 90s, a lot of it, I guess, was probably more looking at differential equations or quite simple equation systems that you can do some neat algebraics and get some idea of what's happening with the system. But now you can take things where you might not even fully be able to write down all the equations for the system, but you've got some algorithm that you're running on massive computers. And all it does is you can do more in that sense, but it creates then new challenges. Like, how do you compare all these different models? How much, like you say, how much detail should you be putting in? When should you be putting in this detail? And how compare? So there's I guess changes outside of the field in terms of increased computing power have thrown up new challenges within the field, as well as advancements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes, it really is a whole different ballgame, but there's a lot of, because it's so easy to do things numerically, I think there's a temptation sometimes not to stop and think, but just to plow straight for the computational things, whereas people might, like me, with a more traditional background, like to sort of stop and think first about, what do we already know? What does the theory tell us? And how do we build on with that, rather than discovering some of the well-known theoretical results, coming out of the numerical stuff. It's a different approach, but both really need to work together.
Can I pick up a bit on the recent programme with you that you are co-organising? Because it's a very different programme to how, I guess, having such a long-standing history with the INI, it's very different to how things would normally run at the INI for many different reasons. And so I guess I'm quite interested to get your opinion on how you found being an organizer on the program, and sort of, I guess maybe just as well, a bit of background about sort of how the program came about, and why it's so important, and why the Isaac Newton Institute maybe is a great place to be running this program, and why it's so important at the moment.
Gosh, there are a lot of questions there, and I shan't address one of them. How it came about, I suppose, comes through the RAMP, the Royal Society Initiative, bringing together experts back in March, I suppose, people who could contribute in some way, and looking towards how some of that expertise might best be organised, and conversations between those and David Abrahams, the director of the Institute. So the idea of having a virtual programme was sort of formulated, and obviously people like me who've been involved in the previous programs. Dennis Mollison was another co-organizer who started, from those initial programs. It's really interesting that you look back then and see who was involved then. And of course, this was 30 years ago when we were writing those proposals. So we were very much mid-career, not the sort of senior end, age-wise, that we seem to be now. But people that were involved then, Graham Medley, who chairs SPIAM, co-organised a workshop in that original programme with me, and we produced a volume then. Angela McLean was a very active participant, now, of course, Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Defence and so on. So we've seen these people coming through, in the 2013, you get another generation of people coming in and sort of moving along the field. And now, again, we're bringing people into this programme. But to try and answer some of the things that you mentioned, it is very different being virtual. So we've got this group, and the Institute had been already setting up, even before the pandemic was thought about, the idea of doing more in terms of hybrid activities and online things. So had been moving a bit in that direction, particularly, I think, with gateway events and so on. But so there were things that were in place and could be, put to good use here. But it's been quite a challenge doing things virtually. I think there are there are advantages and disadvantages, and I'm sure you're very well aware, because you've been very, very, well, I was going to say knee deep, but no, shoulders deep, and hopefully not over your head, but very involved. So there are lots of pluses. It means that we can involve people all around the world very easily. And we can have a really good diversity of participants. The downside of that is that people aren't coming on sabbatical as they would normally be at the Institute. I mean, even if they're only there for a week, they've left their day job behind, and many are participants for 3 or 6, even 6 months, and they're away. And okay, the day job doesn't totally go away, and people would disappear off to their offices and catch up with their email for an hour or two. But nevertheless, they were focused on the programme in a way which is not happening this time. Most of the participants this time are very, very busy and involved in modelling the current pandemic, advising their home governments or whatever else. So there's a difference in what people can contribute and the amount of attention they can give the programme. But we benefit from having all this expertise and being very much in the thick of what's happening at the moment. Which is wonderful.
Can I ask you? Sorry to interrupt, Ciara. Can I ask you, Valerie, about the personal side of it? Because I imagine, having spent so much time with colleagues over the years, you will have developed close relationships, friendships, and that, I'm guessing, is slightly lessened now. Is that something you've noticed, and is it something that's affected you in the programme?
A lot of the people that we're talking to, well, quite a few people I've known for 30 years, and we've known each other. I think the hardest thing, any of the people who've been involved in previous workshops would know each other quite well. And then when you move online, that's not a particular barrier. You just pick up where you left off, as it were. I think the harder thing is to get new people involved. Especially, I mean, all these programs, one of the focuses has been to bring together a very wide range of expertise, not just in maths and stats and computing, but the immunologists and the medics and many, many fields. And I suppose breaking down barriers between disciplines is harder when you're meeting people for the first time online. I think it's also more difficult for people, perhaps particularly the younger people, the PhD students or whoever. Perhaps it's harder to feel involved. Much easier if you're standing next to somebody at the coffee machine to start up a conversation. And however much you try to integrate everybody with online discussions, if they're small enough, you can do it. But if it's a big group, it's harder to involve people. So I think, there are issues there. But certainly, I'm sure that we are bringing together people who haven't worked together before. And, there will be new work, new collaborations coming out of the programme.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you did touch upon earlier that is very unique to IDP is, I think, the fact that there's a small group of people involved who are incredibly busy. And so they're often the people that everybody wants to talk to and would like to get at all the meetings. Mm-hmm. And they're the people who you really want to try and connect with all these other communities that want to come in. And so some of it is an issue of trying to do all this virtually is very challenging. And some of it is also to do with the fact that they're very busy. But just touching also on the fact that it is difficult to do virtually, I think one thing that I think it's very easy to focus on the negatives of the current situation. But I think it's been, one, if with all the people being so busy, I think if it hadn't been virtual and it was actually at the Institute, you wouldn't have even got half of these people. They have actually been able to squeeze in a half an hour to just come in and give their opinion, which they wouldn't have been able to do were we actually holding it in a building. And secondly, I think it's definitely not as nice always when you're trying to do these things virtually, but I think it's been important to kind of keep the mathematics community and building on the mathematics, keep it going as well, because I think we can't sort of stop and for like 2 or 3 years and not do any research. And I think the program, at least to me, has shown it's difficult, but you can do it. You can bring these communities together. And I feel like, I don't know about you, Valerie, but I feel like I've learned an awful lot on this program about ways that didn't work, things that did work better, and ideas about how we could improve things. And so I think sometimes it's about jumping in, even though if it may not be the way we'd like to do it, because we have got, I mean, there are communities that are talking to each other now. And I guess I'm thinking of just from the meeting this morning, you've got the uncertainty quantification community who are now talking a bit more to a lot of the epidemiologists. And those conversations were difficult to get started, but they are starting and they are talking and they are seeing each other's perspectives and understanding a bit more. And so I think it's still important to try to do these cross-disciplinary interactions, even though they can be challenging.
I think I agree with absolutely all that. I mean, certainly going right back to what you said at the beginning, we certainly had talks from people like Angela McClone and Graham Medley right at the outset of this program. They would never have had time in early May to come up to the Institute and give a talk. But by having them maybe slotting in early evening, online, whatever, we were able to get them involved. Secondly, thing to say is that, of course, the fact that the Institute routinely records all its talks means that people can even keep up with things in a way which they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So that's really, really good. But I think in terms of what we're doing now and the things that work and don't work, I think that's going to be really useful going forward. I think we can all see, well, there's the next year or two when who knows how the Institute's going to be able to work. And the likelihood is we're going to have a lot more in the way of hybrid programs for a while at least. But also longer term, I think there'll be much more scope for trying to run things in a way which allows people to spend time in programs, hopefully with some sort of sabbatical time to be able to enable them to do it properly, but from their home institution, so that they are doing it virtually. And the experiences that we're getting now in sort of what works and what doesn't work and how to do things, I think will be very useful going forward. You know, it's not just for this program, but for a lot of future things that the Institute will do.
Another advantage perhaps might be that normally it would have a set lifespan because things are booked in years in advance. And in this case, it began earlier this year, but it's just been extended, hasn't it? And I should say this will be in the show notes, and I did mention it at the beginning, but the full title is Infectious Dynamics of Pandemics, Mathematical and Statistical Challenges in Understanding the Dynamics of Infectious Disease Pandemics. So I just wanted to make that clear to anyone who's listening.
Yes, and it is going on. So originally it was planned for a few months. I think the hope when we were writing the proposal sort of in April would have been the Institute hope was that, you know, things would be back up, the normal service would be resumed later in the year. And so it was a question of what could be fitted in while the Institute wasn't being used for its normal purposes. And obviously the time at which it's going to be able to reopen properly with full-time programs in the building is sort of receding. But also the sort of facilities that a virtual program like this need are very different, and so to some extent can continue to run even if there are other activities going on. But as you say, the program has been extended. It's now running until the end of the year, and I don't know, I wouldn't be totally surprised if it didn't go on in some capacity beyond that, simply because there's a group of people who are talking together and want to continue. Now, we could all do that separately on our own personal Zoom channels, but obviously focusing through the Institute is wonderful. So as long as it can continue, I think we'll be keen to do that. But the other thing you touched on was the fact that normally a Newton program would be approved 2 years in advance. So it's gone through all that planning. We've got a proposal. It's been approved by the Scientific Steering Committee. And then we've got 2 years really to hone that proposal, which will be done between the organisers and the Institute. And of course, we haven't had any of that. So we're really, it's really, running by the, I don't know how to put it, but it is all very last minute, the planning. There's no time to sort of stop and think. One's always trying to catch up with where you would like to be. I mean, one of the incredible things is that in a normal program, to get people to take part, you do need to work well ahead. They need those 2 years in their invitation so that they can slot in some sabbatical time away from their home institution, home teaching, whatever. And now we are, well, Ciara will know because she's doing most of it. You can contact people and say, well, could you give a talk on Thursday? And you do mean this week, and it happens. So it's just very, very different.
Yeah, I feel like there's been quite a shift in I felt, particularly when the program really began, this like sense of urgency within the community that I've kind of never really experienced in the same way. Like this feeling that the community needed to come together and we all needed to try and work and do what we could to try and, provide the best scientific advice and, to help all the modelers in the thick of it, and to make sure that information was being better communicated. And so I think people were prepared to sort of throw a couple of slides together and just give a talk and just discuss what they were thinking, and work often being presented maybe quite unfinished, but people didn't mind because it was all about trying to make things as transparent as possible and all learning and working together, which I found, and just completely, I mean, like, I'm used to the idea of papers taking years to pull together and people are talking about, writing a paper and putting it on archive in like a couple of days, and then you've got the challenge of all the papers coming out and dealing through all the massive literature that's not been peer reviewed and stuff. So it was just I feel like it was very different, a different sort of side that I've seen. And that's why I don't know whether your opinion of this, Valerie, but I think places like the Newton Institute can be quite useful in that you've got this big community, all of whom want to help, and having somewhere to kind of pull everybody together and organize everyone. And I guess pull in from, many of the people might not have been on some of the epidemics programs at I&I, but they knew I&I from other things like the uncertainty quantification program or, other programs that they've been on previously. And so it provides a kind of central point, a kind of a common territory, I guess, as it were, so that they can all come together and sort of discuss and find out how they can move forwards with things.
Oh, absolutely, because the community is getting bigger all the time. I mean, as I say, right from the outset, we were pulling in people across a range of fields, but we're certainly getting a lot more in this program, not just the sort of mathematics fields, but I suppose I can't remember having economists before and behaviour scientists and those sort of things so much. There's things like aerosols and small space dynamics and all sorts of areas which are all relevant and coming together, doing different sorts of mathematics over and above the people that would normally know each other. I tell you a thing which I quite like about about doing it virtual, and something which I think counters the slightly formal aspect, is that it is very informal. You're talking about people coming together and being prepared to talk at a few days' notice and throwing together a few slides without. We're used to writing these papers, as you say, that take ages. We write talks which we hone really carefully. Every slide has got to be absolutely perfect and so on. And now all of a sudden there isn't time for any of that, and people are becoming much more informal. And I think the fact that most people are doing it from their bedroom or wherever, somewhere at home, adds to that formality. And you see a dog wandering off again or something. And this, I think, creates a very, well, for me, I find it a rather friendly environment to be involved in. It makes you less cut off somehow, because you're in this people's home environments. And if everybody was doing it from their departments, it wouldn't be quite the same somehow.
I completely agree. And I think in particular when, all the schools and things were closed as well back in sort of April, May, June time, it was also quite interesting sort of seeing children like coming up and people having to mute themselves while they dealt with a question, or having to say, I'm sorry, I have to leave the meeting because I have to go and make my children's dinner. Yeah. And from some people, quite senior academics. And for me, I really liked that. It kind of reminds you as well that a lot of these people have, that as this is, they've got many other things happening in their lives, and there's other things that they're trying to balance and model. And I did quite like that, that it all became acceptable to say, I'm sorry, I have to mute myself because I've got a child in the background. And no one sort of looked down on you or said, oh, you shouldn't really have your children here, you should be focused on the science. And I thought that was a really nice, I really liked that. And I think as a female, having been in sort of, as a female when I was a postdoc and things, it can be very challenging to sort of have to say, I can't do this because I have to do the school run and things. But it feels like that's become more acceptable, and you don't feel so nervous like you're going to be judged for doing that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's absolutely right.
I do have one question, Valerie. It's like slightly different topic, and I did give you a heads up so that you could think about it. But one thing that I'd be interested, because you've seen this, you've been there from the beginning with the beginning of this growth of this community. And so imagine there'd been a pandemic in 1993 or 1992. What do you think the changes are between then and now in terms of how we've been able to deal with it from a mathematical perspective, how the mathematics has been used and helped to inform policy? And what, do you think we've done that well or better than we would have been able to in 1992? And what do you think the sort of changes are that have happened in that 30 years?
Well, I think we've touched on some of these things already. I mean, all the sort of computational side of things has meant that we can actually do prediction, I suppose, forecasting, short-term things, in a way which we couldn't have done then. I mean, I guess the use of mathematical models has always been, I suppose, twofold, partly prediction, forecasting on the statistical side, but also answering sort of what if. Very much the sort of thing that I've ever done has been much more at the control end. What if we did that? How would that affect what happens? And whether it's hydrology or epidemics, the same thing. This idea of looking at different control strategies and trying to see. And of course, that's been absolutely crucial recently, that sort of approach. But it hasn't been necessary only to have to do it in the context of sets of equations and so on. But taking those equations and actually running them numerically, much more complicated scenarios than we could ever have compared then. I mean, that brings its own challenges. How do you bring together these models? It's the sort of thing we were talking about a bit this morning. How do you assess the uncertainty? Huge amounts of uncertainty that you've got to allow for, uncertainty in the data that you're using, uncertainty in parameter values that you assume, uncertainty particularly in model structure, for lots of things that have got to be really weighed in together. And that's producing lots of challenges. But I think we are in a much, much better position now. We've got a bigger community than we had then, and they're better better linked and prepared. So I think we are in a better position. And I don't remember, so I worked on HIV at the end of the 80s. And so there were things to do with policy there and questions of advising the Department of Health and government more generally. But with HIV, the timescales were different. Everything was in a more relaxed. It was really important, but data was coming in very slowly on what you could do. It's quite slow. So we didn't have the same sort of it's got to be done and it's got to be done by yesterday.
The urgency.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating comparison. Thank you for making that, Valerie. That, as a non-mathematician, that's really helped me understand the value of what's happened over these past few decades.
Mm-hmm.
Can I finish off by asking you a question which goes back to the beginning of our interview? So when I asked you for your a little biographical background, you quite naturally began at your higher education. But can I ask you when you knew that you had a love of maths?
Honestly, I don't know. I suppose, like many of us, as a child, I was good at maths. It came naturally to just the sort of things that you do at school, nothing very high power. But this was the thing that for me was easy. I have never had a good memory, and I hated subjects where I was expected to learn and regurgitate facts. I just found that hard. Something that I could understand and work out was easy. And I think that's true of many people who go into maths, that in some sense we're lazy. A maths exam at school is not hard if you understand what you're doing. You don't have anything to learn because you can do it. It changes when you get to university, of course, but you don't know that at the time. And so I guess it was always there, really.
Mm. That's a really interesting way, but I've never heard anyone say it like that. Have you found it the same way, Ciara?
Yeah, well, one of the lecturers at Warwick did say how mathematicians are lazy.
Yes,
that's why as well they do all this. Some people always say about all they often write in kind of different ways, like they have slightly different. They write symbols instead of words and stuff, and they said that's because they're lazy because they don't want to write the words. They just want to write all the symbols.
Partly that, and partly because in symbols you can be completely precise.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
You have to use a lot of words typically to be as precise as you can in an equation. But yes, I think I've heard it said by many people that it's relatively, you have to put a lot of work sometimes, especially as you get further along in the subject, to actually gain the understanding. But once you do understand something, it's then sort of straightforward, and you can you spend a lot of time stuck before you can make the next jump in understanding. But once you've made that jump, it's something you can do.
Yeah, that makes me often. I shared a flat with people who did law when I did, and they at the end of the day they'd be like, "Oh, I wrote 5 pages of notes," and I'd sometimes say, "Oh, I wrote a line," and then I realised by the end of the day it was wrong. I know why it was wrong, and now I understand more about the question. But it's sort of that's the same thing. But just following on from that, Valerie, then why did you choose your specific specialism? Sort of what was it about that area of mathematics and statistics and things that really?
I don't know. As an undergraduate in the sort of late 60s, we did very little. If you did a maths degree, then most maths degrees didn't involve much, if any, probability and statistics. So as an undergraduate, I think I did 3 courses total. One would have been a sort of an introductory probability and statistics. One was sort of a bit more slightly, second level statistics. And one was on stochastic processes. And I really liked the stochastic process one. And so that made me want to do that for a PhD. But based on, say, one course, not very much. But it was the sort of mathematics I enjoyed. I've always liked the mix of having the theory, but also having a goal, an application, albeit you may be many steps back from the real world, but nevertheless, you've got a scenario with an applied problem that you're trying to solve.
That's really fascinating. Well, Valerie, thank you so much for your time. I think we've taken up a good amount of it so far today, and I know that there's a lot more to do with the programme in the days and weeks to come. So thank you very much for joining us. Ciara, I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to sign off with other than a big thank you.
I did have one question for Valerie, which was, and I asked her this as well before, but whether she had any good book recunrecommendations if people are interested
yes.
in this.
Okay, well, you did give me a heads up on that, but you can obviously cut this bit out of the interview if it goes on too long. But the immediate one that I thought of was this, and I got them out because you've given me a heads up. But so it's called Plagues and Peoples. It's by William McNeill. And it was published in 1977, so it was a book I read well before the first Newton programme. But it's history of how the history of people has been affected by plagues, epidemics, and so on. And there are the well-known things about the sort of way that the Spaniards conquered South America by introducing deliberately or accidentally introducing infections, but there's lots more, and it really makes you think. So that was a great book. Can I add two more? Because I thought of them.
You can. Okay.
Well, two that I really recommend to people. One is The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which came out in 2016. I've always been fascinated by genetics and wished I'd learnt some and never really had time to do it. But that's really the history of genetics from, Mendel's peas and all that sort of thing up to 2016 when it was being written and analysis of genome and gene editing and all those sort of things. So but it's so incredibly well written that you don't need to know very much. It's a book for a layman, but it is really, really good. And the other one, just because I read it recently and I like it, it's a book called The Strangest Man by Graham Farmelow. That's about Paul Dirac. But it's about, again, it's wonderfully written, but it's about him as a man and the personalities and doing mathematics, not particularly about the quantum mechanics and all his detailed work, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I was lucky enough to meet Dirac way back in the...
What was he like?
Was he the strangest man?
Yes, a strange man. But read the book, it's absolutely fascinating.
Cool, thanks Valerie.